Welcome to another episode of Head First with Dr. Hill. Today's guest is Eric Remensperger. Eric is a practicing attorney, been an attorney for about 30 years, and he's been a biohacker and wellness freak for about 20 of those years. And Eric will tell us about this, but he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer after he was deep into the biohacking world, and he took all that knowledge and pointed it at how to hack his own cancer-free state. So welcome to the show, Eric. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, great. So tell us a little bit about your history. Who are you? How did you find yourself? I mean, you and I met because you're, again, a biohacking freak, but
Yes.
how did you start this journey?
Yes, and actually, just before I get into my journey, I wanted to mention that I discovered Peak Brain and you on a podcast I was listening to. I think it was Luke's Story. I don't remember which one it was, because you've been on several, and I think I've heard all of them. And I thought, damn, this guy really knows his stuff, and this sounds very interesting, and I got to check it out. But just kind of stepping back, I can give you a little bit of history. I was as far from healthy as you could possibly be.
Okay.
Until I was about 40 years old. And I lived in New York until 1995. I was a practicing attorney starting in 1984, so for about 10 years. And I was a heavy smoker, 2 packs a day. I was a heavy drinker. I was a workaholic. I was work hard, play hard. That was my life. And it was about 3 years before I moved to Los Angeles in 1995 that I stopped smoking cigarettes and started working out, dabbling in it. And it was after I took the California bar exam in 1995 that in the firm I was working at, which actually had its headquarters in LA, and I was working out of the New York office before I moved out here, wouldn't allow me to take any time off to study for the bar. So I basically took an hour and a half of my day and I studied for the bar. And it was an hour and a half where I wasn't working and I wasn't at home with my family and kids and I wasn't out with my friends, and it was my hour and a half every day. And after the bar exam, I decided I was going to take that hour and a half and just go to the gym. It was going to be my time. I wanted to do something for myself. I really wanted to try to get into physically good shape. I was never physically fit. So that's what I did. And I became a gym rat. I never missed a day. Even if it was 2 in the morning, I belonged to 24-hour fitness. I would go to the gym. And I was on the Men's Health diet, which is, protein and whole grains, no fat. Lots of protein. More protein than you possibly need. Put your Myoplex shade after you work out. And I got to be physically very fit, but I just wasn't healthy. I was having some chronic health problems. And it was about 1997 when I discovered a doctor of Chinese medicine who really kind of turned me on to kind of more energetic, emotional blockages, other aspects that affect health, that got me thinking outside the box. Because prior to that, I didn't really think there was much to anything other than what mainstream was offering. And so I actually invested in and opened a wellness center here in Los Angeles, which was over for about 4 years. And that kind of just got the fire started. And then I just went down this really kind of crazy path of mostly diet-based stuff, where I just studied everything. I was a vegan for a while. I was raw primal for a while.
I didn't know you could do that.
There's a guy named Ajahn Vanderplanets who was a proponent of this diet that was basically raw meat, raw dairy, raw eggs, raw cheese, raw honey, not a lot of vegetables. This was his diet.
Wow.
And
raw meat. Yeah.
And I actually had Ajahn at my house a few times and had dinner over and kind of was in that diet for a while. And I didn't think the people that I met at his potlucks looked all that healthy, so I kind of migrated more into a paleo diet. And then this is before paleo was known as paleo, but that's basically what I was doing on my primary diet. And I was also looking into other versions of wellness, including I got very active in yoga, and yoga became my passion, and I do a lot of yoga. I've done a lot of yoga. I was doing I did the Bikram for 60 days straight, that sort of thing, back when I was doing Bikram. And so that kind of got me started. And then, of course, when podcasts came out, and I discovered kind of all these crazy, biohacking things that you could do, I got into that space, but I stayed more on the what I would consider the natural, holistic, no technology. I wouldn't wear a Fitbit or blue light glasses, but I do wear blue blockers now at home on my computer. But I was mostly in kind of the dietary and the movement and the exercise and breathing techniques and that sort of thing. And that's where I was up until 2016. And I was actually going to a lot of conferences. I was going to the Bulletproof Conference. I was going to the Paleo FX Conference. And it was actually at the Paleo FX Conference in 2016 when I started having some physical illnesses, some ailments. I was having difficulty urinating, which I originally attributed to the fact that there was this electrostimulation device on the exhibition floor that I had them put on my lower abs and turn on full blast because I'm going to show off how tough I was. And I thought perhaps I somehow short-circuited the nerves in my bladder area, and that's why I was having these spasms and I couldn't urinate. But about a week after I got back from Austin, Texas to Los Angeles, I went to see a doctor and then a urologist, and my PSA level was 21.1.
Oh. which is very high.
Extremely high. You don't want to be over 1. 0 to 4 is kind of the reference range.
Yeah.
And I had a whole battery of test runs, PET scan, CAT scan, bone scan, biopsy. And when the call came in on a Wednesday night from my urologist, he said, I just got to give it to you clean. We tested 12 sites, and they,
with needle biopsy.
Yes. For those who haven't had that done, I highly recommend you avoid it if you can. They will only do it once. So even if you have prostate cancer, they won't do it more than once. All 12 sites tested positive, stage 4 cancer, Gleason score 9, outside the prostate, in the lymph nodes, in the bone. He said, you need to see an oncologist immediately.
Yeah, because there's some metastases happening.
Yeah, and here I was for 20 years, just trying to be as clean as I could, right? Nothing but grass-fed beef.
Yeah.
Nothing but, organic this, clean spring water, everything else, live by the beach, clean air, clean sunlight, blah. And so my initial reaction, of course, was just complete shock.
Right.
Like, was all this stuff that I had been doing to be healthy kind of a waste of time? Was I just kind of going down this ridiculous path where I was, but then I kind of came out of that funk. It didn't take long, a couple of days. And I decided this is probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because this passion that I had to be well didn't really have enough of a purpose.
Okay.
Because I had wanted to kind of move out of the, I love my job's great. I'm good at what I do. I've been doing it 30 years, but I don't sit at home at night reading books on the Uniform Commercial Code. I just don't. I read books about health.
That's a law thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm always reading 3 or 4 books, and they all have to do with the same thing.
Yep.
Right. And so anything that's out there, I've read it if it's cutting edge and it has to do with wellness. And so I really kind of wanted to figure out how I could have a story that was compelling, that I really would give something of value to people that was in that space, and I just didn't have it. And so I decided, okay, here we go. Now we got it. Let's just do it. And so I jumped in as deep as I could, and I read 14 books in 21 days. And I just plowed through them. And I could tell because I'm an attorney, I look at context, I kind of read through the words and see who's writing, kind of where their perspective is and that sort of thing. And I decided that I really needed to figure out and come up with my own theory on what caused cancer before I could decide what protocols to use to address cancer. And of course, my oncologist had given me some standard of care treatments, which we can talk about, and was pushing me into doing some chemotherapy or some radiation. And I decided I didn't want to do those until I really kind of got my head around what the causes were.
Right.
And so I spent most of that initial part of that process, that phase, kind of really looking into where what I thought personally, obviously I'm not a scientist, but based on my interpretation of the evidence, what I thought the cause of cancer was. And I kind of stumbled on a lot of different theories.
Sure. Yeah.
There's folks out there that think if you have too much red meat, you're going to get cancer. There's folks that think it's all caused by fungus. There's folks that, these are all over the map. But there's kind of a very kind of common theme amongst what I consider to be the deeper thinkers in the space. And that's, it's a genetic mutation, it's a defect in the genes, or it's a respiratory problem. It's a mitochondrial problem, the Warburg effect. And I kind of looked at both of those and kind of analyzed both of those. And I looked at a lot of the PubMed studies on there's not a lot on the Warburg side, there's a ton of it on the DNA side. And I decided that based on my own theory as to how I got cancer, we can talk about that too, it was clearly something more energetic than it was genetic.
Okay.
And the Warburg theory made perfect sense to me. And he got a Nobel Prize.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. The way cells respirate normally is they actually use oxygen to create ATP. Okay, and they burn glucose as part of that process, or they burn ketones as part of that process. But it's really it's an oxygen-based metabolic process. Cancer cells are unable to respirate oxygen.
So they're anaerobic?
They're anaerobic, and so they can only burn glucose, okay? And as a result of that, they're creating energy through a fermentation process. Okay, so
that's interesting.
And what's really interesting, and we can get into this a little more later on if it's important, we have time for it, is before there were life forms on Earth, before there's oxygen on the Earth, all life forms were necessarily in this the burning of glucose state, right? Where they're creating all this lactic acid, right? The fermentation process. And so if you take a healthy cell and you deprive it of enough oxygen, it will basically revert back to its prehistoric form of energy production.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so in my perspective, there is definitely a link between the ability of the cells to be properly oxygenated and cancer. And it's this shift from what Warburg discovered, which is this: if there's not enough, if the cells are not able to respirate properly, they start fermenting. In the course of that, in the course of shifting into that, it creates a lot of ancillary damage, including DNA damage, including fungus growth around the cells.
So it links the
So all these other
causes.
theories are right, but they're just not necessarily the root cause.
Right.
They're just part of the development of the disease.
Yep.
Right. So the progression, it may actually come early enough in the process before you even recognize there's cancer. Therefore, it appears to be the cause. Right. Because the initial stages of cancer are so early you can't even detect them.
Right.
In fact, one of the questions that I get asked quite often is, or statements that are made, they say, well, you've cured yourself of cancer. And I don't like to use the word cure.
Well, we all have cancerous cells.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And people need to realize that. If you do an oncoblot test on anybody, you're going to discover cancer cells. The question is your body in a cancering, I like to use the verb version of it, state, or is it a healing state? And if you find yourself in a cancering state long enough, you will have what ultimately is diagnosed as cancer. And what you need to do is figure out how to push yourself back into the healing state. And so that was my goal, is to transition myself back into a healing state. And so that's the whole Warburg theory. And at the time Warburg got his Nobel Prize, they didn't really understand the mitochondria yet. That came out a little later on. And Pete Peterson discovered that. He also was looking into this whole mitochondrial base. Just for your listeners who may not be familiar, the mitochondria is like an organelle within the cell.
Right.
Some cells have thousands of them, and some have very few, and some have none. Blood
used to be a different creature.
Yes, it used to be.
Evolutionarily.
Biologically, it was different, and it kind of got absorbed into the cell. And that's the energy source. That's where the energy is generated. That's what makes us warm-blooded creatures, right? If it weren't for that little fire going on inside that little organelle, there would be no heat generated by our bodies. So when we talk about kind of life and life energy, you really got to point, on a scientific level, you got to point to the mitochondria as a major player in that game. And healthy cells, the mitochondria is the source of their energy. Cancer cells, the mitochondria is defective, okay? And their energy production is actually done in the cytoplasm.
Oh, really?
It's done in the mitochondria too, but this respiration, this lack of respiration, the fermentation process, is really done more in the cytoplasm. And so you want to kind of force your healthy cells into more of a healthy mitochondria space, and your unhealthy cells more into you can't get your fuel you need, which is glucose space.
And this is probably why, fasting and low sugar diets and things have some benefit in cancer.
Right. That's correct.
Seems to starve the cancers faster than it starves the. I mean, that's my theory. This Warburg versus genetic is a new perspective for me.
Right.
My perspective on the fasting benefits for cancer were about robbing the greedier cells of their fuel source.
Correct.
And so they failed first.
Correct. Because the amount of glucose that a cancer cell needs is significant, which is how a PET scan works, right?
Right.
All the PET scan is, we'll take some glucose, we'll put in some radioisotopes, we'll inject it in your system, and then we'll run you through a machine that looks for radioisotopes, and we'll see where it's congregating, where it's coagulating, where you have concentrations. High concentrations means there's cancer. Because otherwise it would just be dissipating throughout your body.
Got it.
Because they're just such sponges for that stuff. So anything you can do to lower the levels of glucose is, I think, a therapeutic plus. And so the first thing that I did to kind of address the condition is interesting, because I didn't know at the time, I hadn't really developed a lot of these theories, was I did an 8-day water fast. It's funny you mentioned fasting. And I didn't originally intend to do an 8-day water fast. I intended to do a 10-day cleanse, the master cleanse was my plan. Because I read a book on prostate health that talked about you got to do the master cleanse. And it involved lemon juice, cayenne pepper, and maple syrup.
Sure.
And I literally took, half a day's dose of that, and I went into sugar shock. My body just went crazy, and I said, this is not going to work. This is definitely not going to work. So I decided I'm just going to do water. So I did a water fast. And it's interesting because in hindsight, that was probably the smartest thing I could have done, because it put me in a very high level of ketosis, right?
Yeah.
I was burning, my ketones are probably 6 or 7 at that point. And I had been dabbling in ketosis before I got sick. I had actually January 1st of that year, and of course I got diagnosed in July, I started experimenting with ketosis, but more at a nutritional level, which is 0.5 millimolars or more. And therapeutic ketosis is over 2. And so I pushed myself into the therapeutic level on the theory, what you just mentioned, is let's really feed your healthy cells that can thrive on fats as a fuel source and starve the cancer cells because there's less glucose available for their primary fuel source. And So that was one of the smartest things I probably could
So
have
sorry,
done.
let me unpack nutritionally versus therapeutic. So nutritionally meaning ketones we're generating from fat sources and fuel, and therapeutic meaning...
Well, they're both ketones, but the question is how high you're going to push your level of ketones.
Okay.
Okay. Because it was easy for me to put myself in a higher ketotic state because I had already been doing the Paleo Diet for several years, so I was already fat adapted. Someone who's been a high, very high carbohydrate diet, they might go through a month or two of the keto flu before their body can actually transition into burning ketones. But the only difference between regular ketosis, which is lower levels, and therapeutic is just more ketones. And quite often you do exogenous ketones to get your levels that high. And Dom D'Agostino and others out of who have been focused on this science have been doing a lot of work in that space. I do take brain octane, which is beta hydroxybutyrate.
Sure. BHB.
Yeah, I do that in my coffee, and I do it probably every day.
Do you think that dietary ketones are producing the same kind of metabolic signature from endogenous produced ketones when you're turning fat into ketones? I mean, I see these ads for ketone-based products.
Right.
Oh, you're instantly in ketosis after swallowing a product. But if you haven't burned the 500 calories or 50 grams of glycogen out of your muscles, the stored carbs, it seems to me like you can't truly be in a metabolic ketosis, and what we're getting is masked,
I think you're right.
Urine, essentially.
I think you're right. You'll get some of the initial benefits of ketosis, kind of clarity of thought, and less
because
less hunger.
Because you're feeding the brain at that point
yes.
with the ketones.
Yeah, your brain's not saying feed me, feed me, feed me. I need some sugar right away.
But in terms of the anti-inflammatory things,
no, I actually try, other than the brain octane or the beta hydroxybutyrate, I don't really do much in the way of exogenous ketones.
Okay.
And the way I primarily try to keep my level of ketones up is through fasting. So I do a lot of fasting. And I can talk briefly about kind of where I was before I got sick and my diet now, because there was a big component of my diet before I got sick that I think contributed to not the fact that I got cancer, but certainly the aggressiveness of the cancer. Because when I got a cancer, it was pretty damn. It wasn't like, oh, guess what? You got a little bit of cancer.
Yeah, prostate's one of these cancers. For those that don't know, I mean, many more men will die with prostate cancer than from prostate cancer. It's indolent or indolent lazy cancer. It tends to not progress very rapidly.
That's right.
So most men, you're a little older than me, but not a lot. Most men our age have some precancerous cells and PSA as a reaction to that precancerous state. Why do you think it took off?
Well, it's because I was in this crazy kick where I was doing this absolutely insane daily shake that I made every day that I packed with as many nutrients as I could. Andrew, this shake had so much stuff in it that I met Ben Griefel at a party and I showed it to him and he said, "Oh my God!" And he put a blog post up of his crazy shake, and at the end he said, "You want to see a real nut job? Check out this guy Eric." And he listed. This is before I knew I was sick, right?
Yeah.
And I had this every day, and I had maca in there, and I had what is it? The Japanese fermented Japanese natto. I had natto in there. I took chicken liver and I froze it and I cut it up. I put some raw chicken liver. I had everything healthy I could put in there, right? It was just packed full of stuff. It took me 2 hours on the weekends to do all the dry powder and then another hour each day to kind of prep it. And then I'd soak it overnight and then blend it. And it was a daily thing. Well, the problem was I was not giving my body a chance to go through autophagy. Right? I was never giving
cleaning
my
out dead cells.
The intercellular cleanup never happened. And so I was just constantly flooding myself with nutrients on this ridiculous thought that if a little is good, a lot must be great, right? And so my guess is I had so many nutrients flooding my system that not only did it fuel whatever my healthy cells needed, it fueled whatever the cancer cells needed. I mean, they were getting a lot of fuel. And so now what I do is I try to have more of a pulsing effect, right? Ebb and flow, right? The redox. This is redox.
Yeah. I
want movement. I want because there was. Okay, so let's go back to my theories on my study on the theories of cancer. So okay, it's a metabolic disease. I'm convinced of that. It's a defective mitochondria in the cancer cells. I'm convinced of that. So there's a defect in the mitochondria. What causes that? Right now, you got to get on the curtains for that. And when I did a study on that, I came up with quite some interesting stuff. Part of brought me back to traditional Chinese medicine. And this whole idea of qi, right? This whole idea of this energy force, this life force that flows through all of us. And for those of your listeners who are familiar with acupuncture and Chinese medicine, that's a way of manipulating just one component of the qi. That's the meridian component, but it's everything. It's everything in life. It's where your attention goes. That's all life force. And in Chinese medicine, what causes disease can be too much life force in one place, not enough, or stagnation. And in my case, I figured it was stagnation in my root chakra, which is where the prostate is. The prostate is the is the center of procreative and protocreative energy.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look back at my life 4 years before I got diagnosed, I was shut down in both those spaces because I wasn't able to move where my passion was into wellness. And for reasons I don't want to go into, but I wasn't having sex either.
Okay.
For a long period of time, I decided to be celibate for 3 years.
Okay.
And I think those two things both contributed to completely shutting down that kind of root chakra, that energy flow. So, and there's also Wilhelm Reich, and he does, I don't know if we have time to get into his work, but he does a lot of kind of more scientific studies into kind of what he saw as life energy. His orgone theory, I don't know if you know his work.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
But I've read several of his books, and I kind of really got into the weeds on some of this stuff. I was just fascinated by it. This guy's, I mean, anytime I meet somebody, much as yourself, who is so passionate about what they do, that they really live it. Yeah. You know what I mean? They're really they're in the weeds completely. I have to stop and pause and pay attention and kind of really, get to know what they're doing and that sort of thing. And Wilhelm Reich was in that same vein to a fault. And he discovered that there are really kind of two forms of life energy, right? He called them the orgone energy, which was also called PA biones, B-I-O-N-S.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the source of life itself. That's what caused life energy. That's I think Hippocrates also saw that too in the gut. Yeah. He talked about the green something in the gut or something. I forget. Anyway,
or something.
Yeah, and then there's the T bacilli or the T biones, and that's the putrefaction of life. That's when life is kind of turning back to its original state, right? That's when something needs to kind of degrade and
Are these driven by microbes or what?
Well, they're driven, but they're driven. It's not really microbes because they can appear out of nowhere. So it's almost like quantum physics. You can almost take an innate substance and put it kind of in a sterile environment, and this stuff will start to work. And that's what he discovered. It's like, wait a second, how does this work? Right? Yeah. Because everybody said, no, it must come from the atmosphere. Something must get in your test tube, right? You've obviously made mistakes in your lab.
Right.
And no, he did a lot of study on that. And I think he's probably, based on what my interpretation of kind of this energetic cause is, he's probably seeing something that ties right back into this whole kind of source of life. And so that being the case, a lot of the protocols that I adopted really focused on energetic components, things like emotional detoxification, healthy relationships, getting anything out of your life that's not it's to me, the people talk about stress and how stress can affect your health. It's not the acute stress. It's not the car accident or the divorce or the losing your job. That stuff is bad, and it can become a chronic stressor. But your body can actually get some benefit in the redox effect if you get through it properly.
Yep. It's signaling range. I'm really focused. I teach a lot of gerontology, and a lot of the aging stuff I focus on is failures of the system happens when the regulatory range or the signaling capacity is exceeded.
Right.
And it stops varying. We can handle huge spikes of insulin, of cortisol, as long as they
go back
down. In fact, big spikes can be useful, like you're saying. Big cortisol. Right. I mean, cortisol rising in the morning wakes us up. Right. But if it goes up and stays up, our hippocampus dies, and we get depressed. So it's lack of signaling range. I often think about this. Sort of fits into that perspective.
Just get briefly back to Wilhelm Reich. What he discovered was in his laboratories, he looked at a lot of cancer patients and ran them through his orgone machine, which is a very simple device. It was basically just a box to capture this energy. He discovered that before people get cancer and when they have cancer, their autonomic nervous system is only contracting. Now, the autonomic nervous system, as you know, is the sympathetic, parasympathetic ebb and flow. Yeah. And so there needs to be a constant, this constant redox or hermetic effect or movement that's back and forth, right? You build up the tension and you release the tension. You build up the tension, you release the tension. And so he said that's a common theme in all cancer patients. They all have an autonomic nervous system that's only contracting.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is why a lot of older cancer patients have trouble balancing and that sort of thing. So I took all this stuff and I put together what I consider to be probably the most therapeutic protocols I can think of, and I just was throwing everything. My attitude was, look, if it can help my mitochondria, it's a plus. If it's toxic to cancer cells but not toxic to healthy cells, that's a plus. That's why a lot of the oxidative stress therapies that I do are all fall into that camp. And I've done a lot of oxidative stress there. That's kind of my form of chemotherapy, really, is oxygen.
Okay. Things like ozone
and even like high-dose vitamin C, which turns into hydrogen peroxide in your system. When you do it very, very high doses, that's an oxidative stress.
Yep.
Okay.
So you're producing a hormetic signal.
Exactly. That's right.
When you mentioned feeding your body with all these incredible shakes, and that may have been a cause, it reminded me there was a study out a few years ago showing that oral antioxidants decrease health, decrease survival, because they remove the mitochondrial apoptotic, autophagic, hormetic stress signal. When a mitochondria is damaged, it's producing free radicals.
Right.
The cell hears that damaged stream of free radicals coming out and tells the mitochondria to self-destruct.
Right.
And that hormetic sort of damage signal is what the cell uses to tell the mitochondria to self-destruct. It produces another one.
Right.
If you're taking huge amounts of oral antioxidants you reduce the hormetic signal to such an extent that broken mitochondria are not told to self-destruct.
Right. So they continue to do what they do.
And the free radical load actually rises much higher than it would if you didn't supplement at all.
Wow.
So I have a hunch that some of what you did was hijack and suppress the hormetic danger signal in your body.
No question about it. I was doing a lot of, glutathione. I was doing a lot of antioxidant therapies. Not on the therapeutic. I do it now, but I do it kind of in this more hermetic way, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think people don't realize that are trying to do alternative treatments in cancer is they have to understand that oxidative stress and antioxidants shouldn't be overlapped. They shouldn't be. You need to focus on one or the other for the reason you just stated.
Okay.
It wouldn't make sense, for example, to do a lot of oxidative stressors and then take a ton of antioxidants, right? What are you trying to do? You're trying to cancel out the benefit of the oxidative stress, or trying to cancel out the benefit of the antioxidants?
Right.
I choose oxygen to knock out the cancer, and I'll take whatever consequences come along with that. Mm-hmm. But I haven't really seen any. I haven't really seen a lot of changes that I would say, okay, this oxidative stress is destructive of my body.
So no tissue and muscle damage, no increased joint pain, none of that stuff.
No, I had a little bit, but I think it was more from the androgen deprivation treatment I was doing. I was doing some chemical castration. I was doing these ADT shots, yeah.
Okay, so that probably cut growth hormone down then too.
It cut my testosterone to 0.
Wow, what was that subjectively like?
Well...
besides the sexual component, what was it like in terms of focus, aggression, clarity?
It was kind of liberating because, if you're the kind of guy who gets his attention distracted when a pretty woman walks in the room, that never happens.
Okay. It's all that free time.
It gave you a lot of game because you had all this confidence. It didn't make any difference.
Right.
No, there were things. I did have hot flashes. I did have a little bit of joint pain, not a lot. I cycled off. And just as a footnote, for any of your listeners who might have friends or fathers or uncles who are struggling with prostate cancer, you can cycle off Lupron. You can cycle off the ADT. Your doctor won't tell you that. But if you go into PubMed and you do a bunch of research, which I did before I took these drugs, and deciding which ones to take, and then I cycled off, you will find there's plenty of studies out there that show the studies basically say there's no harm in cycling off. They also say there's no benefit in cycling off, which to me is bullshit, if I can say that in your show.
Sure.
Because there's no reason why your body shouldn't be able to go through a period of, let's say, 3, 4, 6, 8 months, whatever, where it has testosterone once again, so it can do its bone development. Everything else testosterone does. Right? Why just spend the rest of your life constantly degenerating without any testosterone?
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting footnote. But getting back to the diet and the mitochondria, that's an area where I kind of really had to do a little bit of a pause, because there's a whole bunch of material out there that suggests that a plant-based diet is probably the most efficacious for cancer.
Okay.
The Ayurvedic diet and the Gerson therapy, and there's a whole slew of stuff out there, and a lot of that involves juicing and kind of high carbohydrate. And I thought, well, how could that be? Because I was not a vegan, but I was a vegetarian for a while, and I know that you're not going to get a lot of fuel sources from anything but carbohydrates on that diet. And so I thought, well, how could that be? And there's also a ton of studies out there more recent studies that show the ketogenic diet is extremely therapeutic too. Certainly with certain cancers like glioblastoma and the blastomas and that sort of thing. And so I was trying to reconcile between the two. And when I was in Tampa at the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, I stumbled on a doctor up there who was studying this space, and I was grilling him on the question, and he said, well, both plants and fat are deuterium depletion foods. And I thought, okay, there's a whole bunch of panel discussions on deuterium and the effects of deuterium on the mitochondria. This whole
deuterium meaning hydrogen.
Yeah, and I'll tell you about it in a second. So this whole conference was about kind of how to use the ketogenic diet as a therapeutic diet. And so they had a whole section on kind of epilepsy and neurodegenerative issues,
huge
right,
for that.
and Alzheimer's, and then a whole section on cancer, right? Those were the kind of the two main branches. And deuterium plays into this, certainly into both, because the mitochondria actually use hydrogen as part of the creation of ATP in that whole Krebs cycle. And deuterium is a very, very small part of the atmosphere and the environment, the foods, everything. It's like 0.015% of all the hydrogen. But it's a hydrogen molecule that's larger, double the size of a normal hydrogen molecule. and that's why I call it heavy hydrogen.
Yeah, heavy water.
Yeah, heavy water is high deuterium water. And if a deuterium molecule gets into your mitochondria, it just mucks it up. It can't function. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And so I'm now just experimenting a little bit on the whole deuterium depleted water and that sort of thing, just to kind of see if there's just any therapeutic benefit there. But it fit square within my theories.
Your model of how this is working.
Yeah, my model on how it's working. So my diet basically is a very high fat plant-based diet with some animal proteins, just more for the nutrient value and anything else. And so I keep my protein levels just to what I need to maintain muscle mass, no more.
Okay, interesting.
And then I do a lot of fasting, and I do a lot of pulsing, a lot of cycling. Like I don't have the same thing every day.
Yeah. It's probably, I mean, again, variability. If the body can, the regulatory domain can adapt, it can often continue to change. And if it stops adapting, I mean, static is death.
Right.
So.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, as you were trying these things, as you were starting to get into different therapeutic techniques, what were, some of the crazy things you tried, let's say, that maybe you either found not successful or you just couldn't
I would say
tolerate?
I don't know if I went that far on a limb. I found coffee enemas to be a struggle for me.
Okay.
I mean, I know that the Gerson says you should do 4 or 5 a day or something ridiculous. I was doing them like once every 2 weeks or once a week. Just the whole idea of how you set it all up and make it all work, and it's messy and it's kind of awkward, and it's I don't think it was certainly not outside the realm of am I going to hurt myself doing this, right? Or in that realm, right? I should say. There were a few things that I actually bought that I thought were kind of more caustic substances that were supposed to be deadly to cancer. One of them, you need DMSO to get into your cells. I forget, it was some chloride or chlorine-based product. And I actually, I stumbled upon this, and I bought some of their product, and I just didn't have the guts to use it. And so it's still sitting on the shelf, and I'd probably throw it away. Because I just felt like, look, if I was just so into being healthy, I just was untrusting of it. I did take B17, Laetrile, which has gotten a lot of interesting press about conspiracies and how the government shut all that stuff down back in the 70s, et cetera. But I do it in its natural state. I just buy bitter apricot pits, and I have a handful every day. To me, it's if it comes from an apricot, I'm not too worried about it. Right. It's not made in some lab. So I can't think of any. I can tell you a few things that I do that are probably a little bit out there.
Okay.
That I still do.
Okay.
I have an exercise, an EWAT machine, the LiveO2 machine at home, which is basically a giant bladder that you fill with oxygen. And then you put a little sensor on your finger to tell your blood oxygen levels are, pulse oximeter. And you get yourself worked up to a state, and you wear a mask. And the mask has a switch. And the switch is either off, which is mimicking high altitude, 15,000 feet, so you're low oxygen. And on is sucking air out of this giant bladder. And so while you're running on your treadmill or working on your incumbent bike, I do it on a Stairmaster, you kind of get your level up and get your oxygen level down.
Okay.
And it causes your capillaries to widen and open up because your body's starving for oxygen. And then you throw that switch. It's like, bam. And now you're getting flooded
Super
with oxygen.
oxygenation.
Yeah. So I do that. I also do hyperbaric oxygen, which I don't think is all that far out there. In fact,
Not anymore. No.
I would recommend I know this is not standard of care, and I'm not a doctor, and please, what I say, this is not medical advice. Let me make sure that's clear. But I would, from my perspective, my own personal opinion is anybody who's facing metastases should absolutely do hyperbaric.
Because that drives oxygen into tissues in a way that nothing else does, or
yes,
okay.
It gets into those little nooks and crannies. And
Literally.
I always kind of knew that because a lot of Dom D'Agostino's work and the folks at the Keto Pet Sanctuary have done a lot of stuff with dogs involving keto and hyperbaric. And a lot of things pointed to the efficacy of it. But then when I was at the Metabolic Therapeutics Conference, I met a gentleman from London who had glioblastoma, and he had the tumor removed, and he was doing fasting, high ketogenic diet, so that in the brain, that causes the cancer to be easier to get out because it pulls in on itself. So it has a clear dividing line between the brain cells and the cancer cells. But on a thermal imaging scan, it still showed he had little bits of cancer floating throughout his brain. And so the only thing he did to change his protocol was he added hyperbaric oxygen. And he did it for 2 or 3 months, and his thermal imaging scan came back and said, you're free and clear.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So I continue to do it once a week.
HBOT?
HBOT, yeah. I mean, I still do it.
You still do ozone therapy as well?
I do. I do it rectal insufflation.
Okay.
And I do it at home.
Okay.
You can buy a little machine that generates ozone gas. It's not water; it's a gas, and you have to have an oxygen tank, and you run it through this machine, and you put in a bladder, and then you stick a
That's
catheter
just
up.
O3, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just taking oxygen and
that's it. It's real easy.
Yeah.
It's real easy. I used to do it every day. Now I do it probably 2-3 days a week.
Okay. And again, that's a hyperoxygenation strategy for you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I do a little bit of hydrogen peroxide too as well, food grade, 35%. You can do it as a bath with a cup and a hot bath. Or you can just take 8 drops and 8 ounces of aloe and drink it. I don't know if it works or not, but it fits into my category. It doesn't hurt me.
Yep.
So I just throw it at the wall and see if it sticks.
Interesting. So it sounds like the biggest, bang for the buck, the silver bullet you've identified for at least your own, defeating of this cancer is oxygen. Is whatever strategy you can use to get more oxygen in, you're taking.
Yes.
What about something like breath work, over breathing, Wim Hof breathing? Do those also oxygenate? I'm not sure I have a clear sense of if they do or not.
Yes, and I actually, because I was interested in oxygenating my cells, I took Wim Hof's course.
You
did?
Okay.
I didn't do the ice baths though. I have to confess, I did the breathing though and the meditation. And I think Wim is absolutely a genius. I do, but I don't think his methods really do much. There's another guy, he wrote a book, it's Patrick McCowan, it's called The Oxygen Advantage. And in there he talks about really how to get oxygen not only into your blood cells, but out of your blood cells into your tissues. And he says that if you just hyperventilate, if you just breathe hard, it actually increases the bond between the oxygen in your blood cells. And it's harder to get that oxygen out of your blood into your tissues.
Oh, interesting.
And the only way to do that is to have enough carbon dioxide in your system. And you can only have enough carbon dioxide in your system
for the exchange, then.
For the exchange, exactly. Is you need to be doing very kind of what I call Ujjayi breath in yoga. It's very still. He said if you run upstairs next to an Olympic athlete, they won't even be breathing hard.
Right.
Because all that oxygen is getting right into their tissues. And your mouth is open and you're breathing hard, and so you're not using your diaphragm. And you're not getting the oxygen into your blood. And you're certainly not getting the oxygen out of your blood into your cells. And so I kind of use Patrick's philosophies more, which is kind of really slow your breath down as much as you can. And there's exercises he has in his book that really kind of help you get really still in your breath.
Oh, interesting.
It's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, a little bit.
It's kind of counterintuitive, but he certainly looked into the science. And the guy, if you read the book, you'll see he's done a lot of work on this. And so again, he's like what I talk about with you. And he's gotten in the weeds. You can notice this is a guy who's.
Now you have me wondering, I do a lot of Ashtanga Yoga. There's a studio right next to Peak Run, obviously, in Culver City. And we do the Ujjayi breath, or not exactly, actually. My teacher, Jorgen Christensen, would say, you breathe with sound.
Right.
And it's
that's actually, that ocean sound breath thing?
Yeah.
That's actually to generate heat in your body.
Exactly. It's generate heat, and it's to be able to observe the quality of your breath to know if it is smooth and continuous, or if you're like and struggling and you can't hold your pose. If your breath is ragged, your energy is ragged, and so adding a slight sound, not so much a Darth Vader breath, but a slight sound allows you to monitor the long, extremely slow, long breath you're doing.
Right.
So I have to wonder if one thing I'm doing in the practice is hyperoxygenating. I mean, certainly we're generating heat, and that long, slow breath, you breathe in and out through your nose only, is dramatically heat generating. When you did your Bikram,
I was when I started doing yoga. I originally, I spent a couple of years doing Bikram because I was living in Manhattan Beach at the time, and that's the only yoga studio they had. So I did the Bikram, and the reason why I did the 60-day challenge is because when I moved to Santa Monica, I decided I'm not going to do Bikram again. I'll just do for 60 days and I'm gone. But so now I do kind of more of a regular vinyasa flow or hatha yoga, and it's shocking to me because I do a fairly advanced class, level 2-3 class, and so I'm holding these poses for a long time. Some are pretty hard poses, and I'm just sweating profusely. I mean, it's literally pouring off of me. You'd think I was just dying. And I'm not even in a hot room, and my breath, you can't even hear it. Right.
Yep.
And that to me is the test of whether or not you're actually in that state. And I think the reason why I can do that is because I'm getting the right amount of CO2 in my system, so this oxygen is getting in my
And so is that state of smooth, controlled, slow breath and sweat pouring off of you, is that a state, do you think, where we are doing efficient oxygen carbon dioxide exchange, oxygen tissues in an increased way?
Yes.
Okay.
One thing Patrick says is just tape your mouth shut. Make sure you're not breathing through your mouth at night. He literally says, do that. Put a piece of tape over your mouth.
Yeah.
Because if you're opening your mouth to breathe at night, you're not oxygenating your cells.
Interesting.
You want to be breathing through your nose. I feel bad for people that may have had nose surgery.
Yeah, I broke my nose a few years ago. Only one side works all that well now. So,
well, I think if you can do the Ujjayi breath in your
enough.
class,
Yeah.
And then there's fire breath. There's fire breath too in yoga too.
There are, and I have to say, even in spite of having a deviated septum on one side and having some slight apnea, doing the Ashtanga Ujjayi breath over a few weeks, the first couple months I did it, opened up the sort of tonic passage, support in the back of my throat. And everything opened up throughout this part of my face.
Right.
And so I would not have been able to always breathe through my nose 5 years ago or 3 years ago.
Right.
But since doing Ashtanga every day, I don't even think about it. And I'm always breathing in and out through my nose. When I sleep, I breathe through my nose more. I still breathe through my mouth and I snore occasionally and stuff. So that, I'm not perfect. But doing that in and out through your nose breathing practice during yoga has trained my body to breathe better through my nose.
Right. That's right.
So getting some benefits. That's great. Although my PSA was 0.3 last time it was checked. So
don't even talk to me.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. Yeah, I don't want to hear it. Mine has been creeping up. My testosterone came back strong, which is great.
Okay.
I felt very happy about that.
Good.
But my PSA level was creeping up less, and it had it tested as like 4.04.
Yeah, a little high.
Which is
but down from where you were is
down
really all
from
that
where
matters.
I was. Yeah.
Right?
So I'm monitoring my condition, and I'm clearly in remission because the bone cancer is gone. My lymph nodes, which were not removed, weren't functioning normally. My prostate actually was normal. It was functioning like a normal prostate.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
probably because you were so healthy in other ways.
And it was back to its normal size, too,
Okay.
which I was thrilled about.
Yeah.
And my goal is to try to maintain that homeostasis and that health in that region.
Yeah.
And so that's one of
Eric, how old are you?
I'm 60.
Oh, wow. I would have guessed much younger. You're a very young looking. I teach aging courses, and I would have guessed, more like, about 10 years younger.
Oh, thank you.
But the prevailing wisdom in gerontology would say the weight, health status, everything that you have at 60,
right.
The consistency of that trajectory to 70, that 10-year age period, will predict everything about the next 20 or 30 years.
Oh, really?
So changes in weight, in oxygenation, in hormone levels, in skin elasticity, any change is a predictor of the next 20 or 30 years of health
Interesting.
status.
I did not know that.
So maintaining all these things you're doing is probably going to give you another 10 or 20 or 30 years after you hit 70, hopefully.
Yeah. That's my goal.
So
we'll see. Something, this is another thing that I find hard for people to really get their head around who haven't gone through what I've gone through. And it's probably hard for some cancer patients to hear me say this, but I have discovered several who have said the same thing. Is honestly, when I look back, this is the best thing that ever happened to me for a couple of reasons. Not only did my passion now have a purpose, but even more important than that is we all think that we can just kick the can down the road, that there's always going to be a tomorrow. Like we have this false idea of our immortality because we live from day to day, right? The sun comes up in the morning. And if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, your priorities would shift quite dramatically, or a month from now, or a year from now, or even 10 years from now. And so when you get diagnosed with something like I got diagnosed with, all of a sudden your tolerance level for being outside of your priorities just goes away, right?
Yeah.
Everything just lines up. This doesn't matter to me anymore. This does. And it just gives you a really kind of a really energetic perspective on life, right? Because you just don't feel like you're spending as much time spinning your wheels.
Reminds me of, there's a book by Stephen and Andrea Levine, which the title escapes me now, but basically it's, I think, called A Year to Live or something, and it's a practice about doing a meditation and mindfulness practice for a year, as if this is your last year to live.
Yes.
And doing meditations around priorities and around relationships and around end of life.
Right.
And it's to sort of hack that perspective in without facing a terminal illness, of some sort.
Right.
You can develop, this benefit by having a severe illness, but you may be able to do it, without, hopefully.
I would encourage those people who can do that to absolutely do it. I mean, I wake up every morning feeling so grateful, just that I'm up for another day.
Yeah.
Just another day.
And gratitude itself has some profound health benefits we're seeing, right?
Yes. Yes. And the gratitude for everything. I mean, you have to have gratitude for getting cancer. How tough is that?
Yeah.
Right? But that's the way it works.
Yeah.
You can't pick and choose. Otherwise, it's just ego gratification.
Right. So you have to move more into the equanimity, being pleased or happy or accepting of how things are.
Right. It's the more Zen. It's the more Buddhic state. Don't be attached to any outcomes at all.
Right. Life is, and therefore, be.
Right.
That's great. So all this has been leading you towards developing a platform.
Correct.
To help share some of this information. I mean, you dug deep, and it took cognitive effort. It took time. It took a lot of, some sweat equity, so to speak. Yeah. So how are you now, besides being an eloquent podcast guest, how are you communicating this to other people who may, need some of this information or benefit from it?
Thank you for asking that question. I've got a website. It was launched on May 15th, so it's fairly new.
Yep.
It's called questtocurecancer.com.
Questtocurecancer.com.
Questtocurecancer.com. And on that site, I have kind of built what I consider to be a framework that helps people kind of understand where the protocols fit within the overall components of their life, whether it's energetic or nutritional based or movement based, that sort of thing. I spent a lot of time trying to break it down. My goal is, which this is kind of, it's interesting because it's a labor of love and a work in progress, and I have no idea where it's going, but I'm just kind of, each day I wake up and take another step in that direction. But my goal is really to provide the tools that people that want to take charge of their own outcome, health, care, etc., have access to the information they need to have in order to make good decisions.
Hey, that's exactly what we do at Peak Brain. It's like, here's your brain, here's what's going on. What do you want to do with it?
Right, exactly.
It's the empowering, the agency giving, demystify this mysterious space.
Right.
And there's conflicting information in brain science, in cancer science. There's lots of conflicting information.
There's no hard line,
So navigating that can be pretty confusing. And, I have a degree in neuroscience.
Right.
And navigating the neuroscience is difficult.
Right.
Which is why, I do a lot of the teaching and advocacy and everything else that we do. One thing one question I have, cancer is not cancer from my perspective. I mean, I'm not an oncologist, obviously.
There's sarcoma, carcinoma, glug.
And some of these have well-known causes,
Right.
and some have fewer known, less well-known causes.
Right.
Is this perspective of genetic versus, let's say, mitochondrial?
Right.
Is that, from your perspective, seeming to be true across forms of cancer?
That's a really good question. And I'm actually just kind of getting into the weeds on that stuff fairly recently, kind of just looking at the different sources of cancer. I focus mostly on the hard tumor cancers because that's what I have. So breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, they all kind of fall into the same category. Some of the other cancers, like the blastomas and the carcinomas, obviously have totally different outcomes. For example,
and mechanisms.
I think there are treatment protocols in the standard of care, for example, for certain types of blood cancer that are probably not that toxic, where they remove the blood from your body, they run it through chemotherapy, they filter out the chemotherapy, they put the blood back in your body. To me, that's less devastating. Your blood doesn't have a lot of mitochondria, by the way.
Right.
If it has any mitochondria. I don't know if it has, the blood cells, I don't think have any mitochondria. And so, I think the treatment protocols would be different for different types of cancer. That's a really good question. If you look at kind of how I built it on the website, you'll see that there's one pillar called therapeutic interventions, and all the other pillars, and there's 4 other pillars, are all things, even people that don't have cancer that want to avoid cancer would probably be well advised to take a look at.
Great.
And so those things I think anybody with cancer should be doing, period, just to get, once they're back in the healing state, to stay in the healing state. And then the therapeutic interventions are the things that people like me want to look into, like the high-dose vitamin C and the hyperbaric oxygen. These are things that I think are specific to people struggling with the illness. But that's a really good question. But I think one more kind of footnote I want to just tag on to the earlier statement about educating people. Even the best doctor in the world is only going to be able to give you a very tiny, tiny amount of attention.
Right.
And so if you're not willing to step up to the plate and figure out what's right for you based on your own determination, you're necessarily putting your hands in someone else who's got other priorities, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really incumbent upon people that really want to get well to kind of take a more proactive approach. And I'm not saying you wouldn't do a lot of the stuff in conjunction with standard of care. I'm not in a position to draw that line. It's not my role. I'm not a doctor. I can't give that advice. But I'm saying if you can, you don't rush into anything unless you have to.
Right.
Adopt the wait-and-see attitude. Try some of these other therapies first.
Yeah, if you're having active seizures and bleeding from brain tumors, you may need to go to the hospital and get a surgery right away.
I couldn't urinate, so taking ADT wasn't even a big challenge for me to do. But I did it in a very minor. I did a smaller dose. I did the monthly versus the 6 month or the 3 month version of it.
It's interesting. So from a gerontology perspective, the biggest risk factor for cancer is age. It's the most highly correlated risk factor for cancers, period. I mean, across all types of cancer. I have to imagine, and I haven't looked at your website yet, I have to imagine the pillars of either treatment or keeping yourself healthy, those must also be in line with long life, anti-aging kind of perspectives often. I mean, we certainly know things like ketogenic diets and getting enough exercise, and those are all anti-aging, and those are probably also anti-cancer.
Yes, exactly. There's definitely an overlap.
So I'm just curious, are you finding a lot of of the gerontological, the geriatrician perspective, like aging medicine people, are you bumping up against them when you're doing this dive into what things may work to hack the system?
Yes. I don't know if you know Rhonda Patrick. I'm sure you've stumbled upon her.
Sure,
she's one of the folks that I pay some attention to. I think she's great. She's very much into anti-aging. That's her kind of her bone.
Yeah.
And two of the things that actually one of which I put very, very highly on my list of kind of nutritional supplements, which is turmeric, curcumin.
Yep.
And that to me is, I do it in all sorts of ways, right? There's several ways I take it. And the other is sulforaphane. And both of these are...
Which is in cruciferous vegetables.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I take 3 different versions of sulforaphane.
Mm-hmm.
And these are both, I think they're both found to be kind of anti-inflammatory, very powerful ways of kind of maintaining health and longevity, keeping your telomeres long, all that good stuff.
How are you getting turmeric into your system with good absorption? Because it doesn't tend to be absorbed orally all that well unless you mix it with things that suppress the enzyme. You can take black pepper with turmeric.
Right. Now they say fat's better than black pepper, so I do it with some brain octane.
Is it? Interesting.
Yeah.
Just for absorption, then.
Just for absorption. So I do it really kind of several ways. I take pills that have turmeric, curcumin in it. Mm-hmm. Thorne product. Thorne has a couple of good products that I take. I also have the root itself that I put in might have this new version of my shake, which is definitely less intense.
Less insane,
way less insane. And I do that now. I don't do that every day. I do it probably 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And I put a whole bunch of turmeric root in there with brain octane, with fat, and maybe some pepper. But I grind it into my food at night. Mm-hmm. And I also have this shake or this kind of little tea. I make pau d'arco tea, which is also
pau d'arco, sure, yeah.
And I make the pau d'arco tea with some curcumin powder in it, and some Ceylon cinnamon powder in it, and some brain octane, and I leave that in the bullet blender for like 2 minutes, so it's completely emulsified.
Yeah.
And I drink that when I take all my stack, and I have a stack of supplements that I take, which are on my website, by the way.
Okay.
Folks interested?
Great. I'll check it out.
And I take that. What that's supposed to do, if it works, and I don't know, I'm assuming, is the curcumin in that little tea helps the assimilation of all the other vitamins I'm taking.
Okay, and the fat helps the curcumin.
And the fat helps.
It's nice to hear there's another option besides black pepper, because black pepper is a nice hack. But if you're on other drugs, the same liver enzyme breaks down, and you take black pepper, you're going to have massive spikes of your other drugs in your system.
Right.
And so you can end up in a polypharmacy kind of situation where you're causing interactions in your own body without any change in oral dosing.
Right. No, I know that. In fact, if you do the pau d'arco tea thing I'm talking about, and you're taking pharmaceutical drugs, you might want to have your doctor check and make sure don't need to lower your dose a little bit.
Does it also? Because
it'll have the same effect of increasing the.
So it suppresses some of the same CPK whatever enzymes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Good to know. Yeah.
Again, I'm not a doctor. I just read this stuff.
It's information.
Yeah,
exactly.
And that sort of.
Yeah. The thrust of the podcast is here's some information.
Right.
We don't ever expect we're going to be experts in everything, or even know everything, or even be right.
Yes.
But
by the
asking the questions is important.
By the way, in this space, you never ever get to the end result.
Ever.
You never ever get to the point you say, okay, I got this thing.
Which is exactly how I feel about the brain. It's always a phenomena we're sort of managing and digging out and looking under stones to figure out what's going on. But it's always an imperfect. When I started doing neurofeedback, something you said about how people were viewing different cancers. When I started viewing how the brain worked in neurofeedback, there was 3 or 4 different schools of thought that completely different ideas about how it worked, and yet they're all getting great results.
Right.
And the same thing in different alternative therapies for cancer, ketogenics or other hyperbarics and ozone. They all work. So this strikes me as what I call blind men and elephant situation. We're like, oh, I have a leaf, I have a snake. No, we're all a little bit confused about what's going on.
Right.
And I was talking to Luke about this, Luke's story on the last podcast, that I think a really important perspective to have, be it hacking your own health, be it being a professional who teaches this stuff, is the ability to say, don't know. There's a bit of information here.
Right.
I may have some context for it. I may not. And that's, you've given people things to dig into themselves. I hope no one listens to this podcast and rushes out and just takes all the things.
No,
but,
please.
But hopefully they've heard about a half dozen things. They can look up on your website and they can do some more research and decide if it's right for them.
Exactly.
So it's perfect.
Exactly. Exactly. Isn't that what science is all about, though? Is you always have to
Hopefully
try to. I know it hasn't become that lately. I have a whole section, by the way, and I know we're going to run out of time soon, but I have a whole section on the website as to why you need to take charge of your own healthcare, and I have 10 reasons in there. Because I've looked at a lot of these studies, and this is so-called evidence-based medicine, and I'm not saying it's all bad. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but I'm just saying a lot of it is colored.
And also, a lot of science is valid. Findings and conclusions in science are valid at a population level, or at a 100 subjects level. But break down when you look at one individual, because they don't necessarily fit into the middle 2/3 of this, the bell curve.
Right.
And so, we don't know everything, and that's really important to know.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
Well, Eric, it's so wonderful to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
Your website again is thequesttocurecancer.com. Is that a 2 or a T-O?
T-O. www.quest2curecancer.com.
Great. Nice and easy.
Yes.
Eric Remensperger has been our guest today. Lawyer, biohacker extraordinaire. Has knocked stage 4 cancer back into submission, remission, and is a vibrant, healthy guy. If you're listening to this on audio only, he's a good-looking, vibrant guy at 60. So you too can take control of your health. And Eric's given some great resources and some great motivation to do so. So again, thanks so much. And folks, this has been another episode of Head First, and take care of those brains.